Imagine the absolute darkest, coldest night you have ever known. A night where the sky is completely devoid of a moon, and the stars reflect on a glassy, silent ocean like frozen diamonds scattered across black velvet. Below the surface, an unforgiving, freezing abyss waits patiently. Above it, a floating palace of light, laughter, and human pride cuts through the dark water at a staggering 22 knots. Music echoes across the deck. Wealthy tycoons toast to their success in the grand dining room, while poor immigrants in the lower decks dance and dream of a bright new future in America. No one aboard knows that they are sailing directly into a trap set by nature itself. By morning, over 1,500 souls will be swallowed by the sea, and the world will be changed forever. This is not just a story of a sinking ship. This is a tale of blinding hubris, unimaginable bravery, and a tragedy that still haunts the depths of the ocean. This is the true story of the RMS Titanic. Welcome, history lovers and seekers of truth. Today we are embarking on a journey back in time, stepping onto the decks of the most famous shipwreck in human history to uncover the hidden truths, the ignored warnings, and the real human stories of the Titanic disaster. Settle in, let the modern world fade away, and listen closely as we set sail into history. Our story does not begin in the middle of the freezing North Atlantic. It begins years earlier in a world driven by fierce competition and burning ambition. In the early 20th century, the ocean liner industry was the lifeblood of global travel. It was the only way to cross the mighty oceans, and the race to dominate the seas was ruthless. The British shipping company Cunard had just launched two spectacular leviathans, the Lusitania and the Mauretania. They were sleek, incredibly fast, and they captured the imagination of the world. Their rival, the White Star Line, realized they could not beat Cunard on speed. So, the chairman of the White Star Line, J. Bruce Ismay, and Lord Purry, the chairman of the massive Harland and Wolff shipyard, made a different gamble. Over a quiet dinner in London, they sketched out a bold new vision. They would not build the fastest ships. They would build the largest, most opulent, and safest ships the world had ever seen. They called them the Olympic class, and the crown jewel of this visionary trio was to be the Titanic. To bring this colossal dream to life, they turned to Thomas Andrews, a brilliant naval architect who poured his heart and soul into every inch of her design. Construction began in Belfast, Ireland, in 1909. Try to picture the sheer scale of this undertaking. Over 15,000 men toiled day and night in the shipyards. The noise of massive hammers striking steel was deafening, echoing across the city from dawn until dusk. These men worked in brutal, dangerous conditions. 3 million steel rivets were driven by hand into her massive hull. The work was so dangerous that 8 men lost their lives before the ship even touched the water. But out of the sweat, blood, and sheer willpower of these workers, a mechanical marvel was born. When she was finally completed, the Titanic was a beast of unprecedented proportions. She was nearly 900 feet long, as tall as an 11-story building, and weighed over 46,000 tons. But what made her truly legendary was her reputation. She featured a double bottom and 16 watertight compartments designed to keep her afloat even if disaster struck. If the hull were punctured, massive watertight doors could be closed with the flip of a switch on the bridge. The engineers proudly declared that even if 4 of these compartments flooded, the ship would remain buoyant. The press took hold of this magnificent engineering feat and gave her a title that would become her curse. They called her unsinkable. It was a word that bred a dangerous, blinding overconfidence. On the morning of April 10, 1912, the sun shone brightly over Southampton, England. The docks were buzzing with an electric, chaotic energy. Thousands of people gathered to watch the majestic maiden voyage of the Ship of Dreams. Smoke billowed from her massive black and buff funnels. The deep, rumbling blast of her horn vibrated through the chests of everyone standing on the shore. Boarding the Titanic was like stepping into a microcosm of the world itself. The ship was divided strictly by class. In first class, the world's richest and most powerful elite settled into suites that rivaled the finest palaces in Europe. John Jacob Astor, the wealthiest man in America, was on board with his young, pregnant wife. Benjamin Guggenheim, the mining magnate, and Isidor Straus, the co-owner of Macy's, walked the polished oak floors. They dined on 10-course meals, relaxed in the grand Turkish baths, and descended the breathtaking grand staircase under a sprawling wrought iron and glass dome. To them, the Atlantic crossing was merely a floating social gala. In second class, journalists, teachers, and mid-level businessmen enjoyed comforts that were better than first class on most other ships. But the beating heart of the Titanic was found deep down in third class, also known as steerage. Here, over 700 immigrants from Ireland, Sweden, Lebanon, and beyond were packed into cramped cabins. They carried everything they owned in worn-out suitcases. They were leaving behind poverty and hardship, risking everything for the promise of the American dream. Their decks were filled with the lively sounds of fiddles, dancing, and hopeful laughter. For them, the Titanic was a vessel of hope. But from the very moment she slipped her moorings, a dark shadow seemed to follow the Titanic. As she navigated out of the harbor, the immense displacement of water caused by her massive propellers sucked a smaller ship, the SS City of New York, violently toward her. The mooring ropes of the New York snapped with the sound of a gunshot. Only the quick thinking of the captain prevented a disastrous collision by mere feet. To the sailors, a near miss on the start of a maiden voyage was a terrible omen. But the excitement quickly overshadowed the fear, and the Titanic sailed onward, stopping briefly in France and Ireland before finally pointing her bow toward the open, endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. For the first few days, the voyage was absolute perfection. The sea was incredibly calm, the weather was crisp, and the passengers marveled at the smooth, vibration-free ride. Captain Edward John Smith, a highly respected veteran of the sea, was commanding his final voyage before retirement. He was affectionately known as the Millionaire's Captain. He walked the decks with a calm authority, greeting the elites and enjoying the serene weather. Down in the Marconi wireless room, two young telegraph operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, were working around the clock. The wireless telegraph was a relatively new marvel, and the wealthy passengers were obsessed with it, sending hundreds of trivial personal messages to their friends back on land. But as Sunday, April 14th dawned, the tone of the voyage began to shift. The air temperature dropped rapidly, biting at the skin of anyone who ventured out onto the boat deck. The Titanic was entering an area of the ocean known as Iceberg Alley. Throughout the day, the wireless room received multiple urgent warnings from other ships in the area. The messages were clear. Massive ice fields and colossal icebergs were floating directly in the path of the Titanic. One warning came from the SS Californian, stating they were surrounded by ice and completely stopped. But the wireless operators, exhausted and overwhelmed by the massive backlog of passenger telegrams, brushed the warnings aside. The final, most crucial warning was never even delivered to the bridge. Despite the dropping temperature and the known risk of ice, Captain Smith did not order the ship to slow down. The Titanic continued to tear through the freezing black water at full speed. This was standard practice at the time. Captains believed that if ice was spotted, a ship could simply turn in time to avoid it. But the conditions that night were a deadly, perfect storm of bad luck. There was no moon in the sky, the sea was dead calm, perfectly flat like a mirror. Without wind, there were no waves to break against the base of an iceberg and create a visible white splash. The darkness camouflaged the deadly mountains of ice, making them completely invisible until it was too late. High up in the crow's nest, two lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lay strained their eyes against the freezing, biting wind. Their faces were numb. Due to a terrible mix-up before the voyage, they had no binoculars. They were relying entirely on the naked eye in total darkness. At 11:40 p.m., a chilling silence hung over the ship. Most of the passengers were asleep in their warm beds. Suddenly, Frederick Fleet noticed something in the darkness directly ahead. It was not a white mountain. It was a massive, pitch-black void blocking out the stars. It was growing larger by the second. Panic surged through his veins. He lunged for the warning bell, ringing it 3 times in rapid, desperate succession. He grabbed the telephone connecting to the bridge. His voice shook as he screamed the words that would echo through history. "Iceberg, right ahead!" First Officer William Murdoch, standing on the bridge, reacted instantly. He ordered the engines reversed and the helm turned hard to starboard. The massive ship slowly, agonizingly began to turn. For a brief, agonizing moment, it seemed they might just clear it. But the Titanic was simply too massive and moving too fast. The ship glided past the iceberg, but underwater, the jagged, unyielding ice scraped violently along the starboard side of the hull. It was not a massive crash, it was a dull, grinding vibration that shuddered through the metal. Many passengers barely felt it. Some described it as the feeling of rolling over 1,000 marbles. In the grand dining room, a faint tremble rattled the crystal glasses. On the lower decks, chunks of ice tumbled onto the deck space, and passengers playfully kicked them around. No one panicked. No alarms were sounded. The great, unsinkable Titanic had only sustained a glancing blow. But deep below the waterline, in the belly of the ship, a fatal wound had been opened. The ice had not sliced the steel, but the immense pressure had buckled the metal plates, popping the iron rivets, and opening a series of narrow slits along the side of the ship. Cold, relentless ocean water was now blasting into the forward compartments under terrifying pressure. The unsinkable giant was bleeding, and the timer had just started on her final hours. Down in the suffocating heat of Boiler Room 6, the reality of the disaster was instantaneous and terrifying. The moment the ship struck the iceberg, a deafening roar echoed through the metal cavern as the starboard hull ripped open. A massive, high-pressure jet of freezing seawater blasted into the room, instantly mixing with the scorching coal dust and creating a blinding, chaotic steam. Firemen and stokers, completely drenched in ice water and sweat, scrambled frantically for the ladders as the heavy watertight doors began to grind shut, sealing the compartment. Deep inside the belly of the ship, the fight for survival had already begun, but it was a fight they were destined to lose. Up on the bridge, Captain Smith ordered Thomas Andrews, the shipbuilder, to inspect the damage. Together with the ship carpenter, Andrews descended into the lower decks. What he saw shattered his heart. The mailroom was completely submerged. Sacks of letters were floating aimlessly in the... Up on the bridge, Captain Smith ordered Thomas Andrews, the shipbuilder, to inspect the damage. Together with the ship carpenter, Andrews descended into the lower decks. What he saw shattered his heart. The mailroom was completely submerged. Sacks of letters were floating aimlessly in the rising dark water. The squash court was flooding rapidly. Andrews did the terrible, unforgiving math in his head. The Titanic was designed to stay afloat with 4 compartments flooded, but the iceberg had fatally wounded her in 5. The immense weight of the water pulling down the bow would inevitably cause the water to spill over the top of the bulkheads into the next compartment, and the next, and the next, just like an ice cube tray filling with water. Andrews looked Captain Smith in the eyes and delivered a death sentence. The ship was going to sink. It was a mathematical certainty. They had, at most, an hour or 2. The chilling reality suddenly gripped Captain Smith. The unsinkable ship was dying, and she only had enough lifeboats for barely half of the people on board. Out of the 2,200 souls on the Titanic, over 1,000 were statistically condemned to die before the evacuation even began. Orders were quietly given to uncover the lifeboats and awaken the passengers. The stewards moved through the corridors, knocking on doors, politely asking the wealthy guests to put on their lifebelts and head up to the boat deck. Many passengers were annoyed. To them, the massive, brightly lit ship felt infinitely safer than a tiny wooden rowboat suspended over a pitch-black, freezing ocean. They joked and laughed, taking their time, oblivious to the fact that beneath their feet, the ocean was swallowing deck after deck. Down in the Marconi room, the atmosphere was frantic. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were furiously tapping away at their telegraph keys. They sent out the traditional distress signal, CQD. When no immediate response came, they switched to the brand new international distress signal. For the first time in history, the letters SOS echoed out across the Atlantic night. They pleaded with anyone who could hear them. "We are sinking fast. Passengers are being put into boats." A few ships responded, but they were hundreds of miles away. The RMS Carpathia received the call and immediately turned her bow toward the Titanic, pushing her engines beyond their limits, but she was at least 4 hours away. The most heartbreaking tragedy of the night lay just a few miles on the horizon. The crew of the Titanic could clearly see the lights of another ship in the distance. It was the SS Californian. Desperate, the officers on the Titanic fired distress rockets high into the dark sky, brilliant white explosions meant to signal a ship in mortal danger. The crew of the Californian saw the rockets. They saw the strange angle of the ship. But through a catastrophic failure of judgment, their captain did not wake his wireless operator. They sat idle in the ice field, watching the greatest maritime disaster in history unfold, and did absolutely nothing. Back on the boat deck, the evacuation was descending into chaos. The strict rule of women and children first was being enforced, but the officers interpreted it differently. Second Officer Lightoller, on the port side, allowed strictly women and children only, launching boats half empty rather than letting a man step inside. First Officer Murdoch, on the starboard side, allowed men to board if there were no women nearby. Heartbreaking farewells took place under the dim light of the deck lamps. Husbands kissed their wives and children goodbye, forcing smiles, promising they would follow in another boat later, knowing full well they would never see each other again. While the first and second class passengers boarded the lifeboats, a completely different nightmare was unfolding deep in the bowels of the ship. Down in third class, hundreds of terrified immigrants were lost in a labyrinth of narrow corridors. They did not speak English, they did not understand the signs, and worst of all, many of the gates leading up to the higher decks were locked shut to comply with American immigration laws. Families huddled together in the rising water, screaming for help, completely abandoned by the crew who were desperately trying to manage the panic above. By the time some brave souls managed to break through the barriers and reach the boat deck, almost all the lifeboats were already gone. Amidst the growing terror, incredible acts of bravery and love shone through the darkness. Isidore Strauss, the elderly co-owner of Macy's department store, was offered a seat in a lifeboat due to his age. He refused, stating he would not go before the younger men. His wife, Ida, stepped out of the lifeboat and stood by his side. She looked at him and said, "Where you go, I go. We have lived together for many years, and we will die together." They were last seen sitting quietly on a pair of deck chairs, holding hands as the freezing water washed over their feet. Benjamin Guggenheim, realizing the ship was doomed, refused a life vest. Instead, he and his valet went to their staterooms and dressed in their finest evening wear. He remarked, "We are dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." And then there was the band. Led by Wallace Hartley, the 8 musicians stood on the sloping deck, playing joyful ragtime music to keep the passengers calm. As the water climbed higher and the panic set in, they did not stop playing. They played until the very end, an ultimate sacrifice to comfort the dying. Their final song, drifting across the freezing water, is said to have been the hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee." By 2:15 a.m., the situation was apocalyptic. The bow was completely underwater. The stern rose high into the night sky, exposing her massive bronze propellers. The majestic forward funnel suddenly snapped under the immense strain, crashing down into the freezing water and crushing dozens of people struggling below. Inside the ship, everything loose began to fall. Grand pianos, crystal chandeliers, heavy oak tables, and hundreds of terrified people tumbled uncontrollably toward the submerged bow. Suddenly, all the lights on the Titanic flickered, flashed brightly for a brief second, and then completely died. The great ship was plunged into absolute darkness. Then came the sound, a sound that the survivors would never be able to scrub from their nightmares. It was a deafening, metallic roar, the sound of tearing steel and exploding rivets. The stress on the keel was too much. The mighty Titanic was breaking in half. The bow, filled with thousands of tons of water, tore away and plummeted toward the ocean floor. The stern slammed back down onto the surface of the water for a brief moment, then slowly began to fill. It rose up one final time, completely vertical, pointing directly up at the star-filled sky. It hung there for a few agonizing minutes, a massive black monolith against the stars. And then, smoothly and rapidly, it slipped beneath the freezing black waves. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic was gone. But the horror was far from over. Over 1,500 people were suddenly plunged into the 28-degree Fahrenheit water. At that temperature, water feels like 1,000 knives piercing the skin. The shock of the cold caused people to gasp uncontrollably, swallowing mouthfuls of seawater. The dark ocean was instantly filled with the frantic, agonizing screams of 1,000 terrified souls fighting for their lives in the pitch blackness. From the lifeboats, a safe distance away, the survivors listened in absolute horror. Some begged the crew to row back and pull people from the water, but the fear of being swamped by desperate drowning victims overpowered their humanity. Out of the 20 lifeboats floating in the dark, only one eventually returned to look for survivors, but they waited too long. By the time they rowed back into the debris field, the agonizing screams had faded into a chilling, dead silence. They found a sea of floating bodies in white life jackets, perfectly still under the starlight. Only a handful of people were pulled alive from the freezing graveyard. For hours, the survivors sat shivering in the lifeboats, surrounded by ice, weeping for the loved ones they had just lost. Finally, as the first light of dawn broke across the horizon, they saw a beautiful, miraculous sight. A red funnel pouring thick black smoke. The RMS Carpathia had arrived. As the sun rose, it revealed a haunting scene. The ocean was completely calm, littered with white icebergs, floating wooden deck chairs, scattered luggage, and the tragic remnants of the ship of dreams. Captain Rostron of the Carpathia took 705 shivering, traumatized survivors aboard. The world would soon awaken to the unimaginable news. The unsinkable Titanic was at the bottom of the Atlantic, taking over 1,500 souls with her to an icy, watery grave. The tragedy of the Titanic sent shockwaves across the globe. It shattered the arrogant belief that mankind could conquer nature with steel and steam. It led to sweeping changes in maritime law, ensuring that ships would forever carry enough lifeboats for every single soul on board, and creating the International Ice Patrol to monitor the dangerous waters. But beyond the rules and regulations, the Titanic remains a powerful, timeless story about human nature. It is a story of blind arrogance and devastating mistakes, but it is equally a story of unbreakable love, duty, and unimaginable courage in the face of absolute doom. The wreckage now rests 2.5 miles down in the crushing darkness of the ocean floor, slowly being consumed by the sea, but the memories of those who sailed on her will never fade away. If this journey into the heartbreaking and deeply human story of the Titanic resonated with you, please hit that like button to show your support. To uncover more fascinating, untold, and deeply moving stories from history, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our upcoming historical deep dives. Your support keeps history alive. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next adventure.